The lights in operating room 3 flickered for the first time at 11:47 p.m. and Dr. Samuel Kwan felt his hands go still above an open chest. Around the table, the surgical team exchanged glances above their masks. The bypass machine kept its rhythm, the monitors held steady. Then the overheads pulsed again and the cardiac output display dropped to 0 for 3 full seconds before snapping back. Nobody said anything. They didn't have to. In the basement 2 floors below, Tobias Merrill already knew. He had been watching the load readout on generator B for 22 minutes, crouched beside the gray equipment rack in the utility corridor with a small notebook open on his knee. The numbers had been climbing since 10 o'clock. He had submitted his first maintenance alert at 10:14, his second at 10:51, his third marked urgent in the system at 11:23. He had also called the operations line twice and left a voicemail for the duty supervisor. No one had returned the calls, no one had acknowledged the alerts. Tobias Merrill was 41 years old, a contracted electrical technician at Pinnacle Medical Center, and he understood exactly what his position meant in a building full of people who outranked him. He had short, dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from years of training it into yourself, until the two become indistinguishable. He wore a gray work shirt with his name stitched above the left pocket and carried a battered red toolbox that had survived 2 overseas deployments and 15 years of electrical work in buildings where a mistake could kill people. His son Milo was 11 years old and had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 8 months after Tobias's wife died of an aneurysm. The job at Pinnacle was the only contract work Tobias had found that carried health insurance. Without it, Milo's insulin alone would cost more than their rent. Tobias understood what being fired would mean. He also understood what he was watching on the load readout. He closed his notebook and walked toward the main operations office for the 4th time that night. Aldous Harwick was standing in the corridor outside the office with 2 members of the hospital's board compliance team. He was in his early 50s, trim and angular, with pale blue eyes and the practiced composure of a man who had spent decades managing impressions. His suit was dark and immaculate even at midnight because Pinnacle Medical was in the middle of a 2-day financial review, and Aldous had not gone home since it began. When Tobias explained that generator B was pulling 15% over its rated load and had been climbing for over an hour, Aldous did not look at the numbers on the tablet Tobias held out. He looked instead at the name stitched above the pocket, at the worn toolbox, at the temporary badge on the lanyard around Tobias's neck. Tobias kept his voice even. He explained that if the load continued rising and the main grid dipped even briefly, the backup wouldn't compensate. He said that OR 3 was running on the backup circuit, and had been since the scheduled maintenance window began at 9 o'clock. He asked for permission to pull generator B offline for 30 minutes and switch the OR circuit to the primary feed, which would require bypassing 2 manual disconnects in the sub-basement. Aldous asked whether Tobias understood that the board's compliance auditors were reviewing energy infrastructure documentation right now. He asked whether Tobias understood what a forced equipment shutdown would appear as in a live audit record. His voice was quiet and almost reasonable, the way a man's voice gets when he has already decided the answer and is simply producing a framework that makes disagreement look foolish. Tobias said he understood. He said the generator didn't care about the audit. Aldous stepped closer and told him that if he submitted one more unsolicited alert through the maintenance system tonight, the operations team would note it as disruptive conduct in his contract file. He said Tobias was a temporary specialist, not an engineer of record, and that load monitoring above his assigned threshold required director-level authorization that Aldous was not prepared to give. Not tonight. Tobias held his gaze for a moment. Then he walked back to the utility corridor, sat beside his toolbox, and opened his notebook to a fresh page. He wrote the time, he wrote what Aldous had said, he wrote the exact load reading at that moment. 118% of rated capacity. Then he pulled his personal voltage meter from the toolbox and clipped it directly to the secondary feed panel, so he could watch the numbers in real time without going through the building's software. At 11:47, the voltage dropped. It recovered in 4 seconds, but 4 seconds was long enough. Tobias stood and was already moving toward the stairwell when he heard the sound he had been dreading. Not an alarm, but silence. The low mechanical hum that ran through every hospital building went flat for half a breath, and in that half breath, the whole structure seemed to hold itself very still, the way a person goes quiet before they understand what they're feeling. Then every alarm in the building came on at once. The OR suite corridor on the 2nd floor erupted. Nurses ran. A physician came through the OR doors with both hands raised as if he had just stepped back from something he could no longer control. Two scrub technicians pushed a crash cart in position near the wall and then stood beside it, unsure. The overhead lights had shifted to emergency power, casting the corridor in a flatter, yellower version of itself that made everyone look a little frightened even before they were. Vera Montoya was the head of security at Pinnacle Medical. She was 6 feet tall in flat shoes, with close-cropped black hair and a bearing that hospital staff had privately described as the kind of person you were genuinely glad was on your side. She had served 8 years in law enforcement and come to private hospital security because she believed that protecting the people who healed others was work that mattered. When the alarms fired, Vera was reviewing the camera grid in the security office. She was on her feet and in the corridor in under 30 seconds. She pulled the charge nurse aside, listened to what the woman described in 20 words, and then turned and walked in the direction opposite everyone else. She found Tobias Merrill in the stairwell between the basement and the first floor, moving up fast, toolbox in hand. Vera had seen Tobias in the building for 3 months. She knew his name from his badge and knew his face from the camera grid and knew almost nothing else about him. What she knew right now was that he was the only person in the building walking toward the problem instead of away from it. She caught his arm at the landing. Her voice was low and direct. The surgeon upstairs had a man's chest open, a bypass machine that had just reset itself, and 90 seconds before a manually restarted pump would either stabilize or fail. She needed to know if there was something he could do. Tobias looked at her for 1 second, then he said, "Sub-basement manual disconnect panel, south wall." Vera said she would follow him. Aldous appeared at the bottom of the stairwell. He had heard the alarms and come down from the operations corridor, and when he saw Tobias with Vera, he took a fast step forward and told them both to stop. His voice had lost the practiced quiet. He said Tobias had no authorization to touch the disconnect panels, that the engineering team was being contacted, and that any unauthorized intervention would compromise the integrity of the facility's emergency response documentation. Vera turned to look at him. She asked how long it would take the engineering team to arrive. Aldous said 30 to 40 minutes. Vera looked at the stairwell door. Behind it, 2 floors up, a man's heart was being kept alive by a machine that had already failed once. She looked back at Aldous. Then she stepped aside and let Tobias through. Aldous called after them that they were making a serious mistake. Neither of them looked back. The sub-basement smelled of concrete and mineral oil. Emergency lights threw orange bars across the floor in alternating stripes. Tobias moved through the room without hesitating, reading the panel labels by memory. Because he had spent his first 2 weeks at Pinnacle walking every corridor in the building and mapping the electrical infrastructure on paper, the way he had been taught to know every system in an aircraft before he trusted his life to it. The south wall panel was a gray metal cabinet bolted into the concrete, secured with a keyed lock and a secondary manual latch. The key was in the operations office. Tobias opened his toolbox and removed a bypass rod he had machined himself from a piece of electrical conduit 14 years ago when he was maintaining power systems on a forward operating base in a country where replacement parts took 3 weeks to arrive. He released the secondary latch in 8 seconds. Inside the cabinet, the circuit was exactly what he had expected. Generator B's load had been rerouted through a junction that was never designed to carry the OR suite at full draw. Whoever had configured the backup schedule at the start of the maintenance window had made a single error in the routing table, and that error had been amplifying for 3 hours. Tobias did not rush. He moved with the same deliberate economy he had used for every task that mattered since he was 23 years old, because he had learned early that hurrying an electrical panel is the fastest way to turn a correctable problem into a permanent one. He isolated the OR circuit, transferred it manually to the primary feed, which was clean, fully loaded, and had been stable all night, and restored Generator B to its standby configuration. The voltage meter he had carried from the utility corridor read nominal within 40 seconds. Upstairs, the overhead lights in OR 3 brightened back to full. The bypass machine beeped once, settled, and resumed the rhythm it had been holding when the lights first flickered. Dr. Kwan exhaled once through his nose and finished the procedure he had been trained 11 years to perform. No one outside the operating room knew how close it had been. No one except Vera, who stood behind Tobias in the sub-basement with her hand on her radio and watched him close the cabinet door and relock the manual latch before he did anything else. She asked him where he learned to do that. Tobias said the Navy. Vera went very still. She looked at the cabinet, then at the bypass rod Tobias was replacing in his toolbox, then at his face with its tired eyes and the gray at his temples, and something clicked into place that she hadn't expected. She asked his last name again. He told her. She said she had read an incident report 6 years ago from a training facility fire in Virginia. The report described an off-duty electrical specialist who had restored emergency power to a building where 3 firefighters were trapped in a smoke-filled corridor. The specialist was not named in the public version of the report. Vera had accessed the full version during her law enforcement career because the incident had been used as a case study for cross-agency emergency response. Tobias said he remembered the fire. Vera was quiet for a moment, then she picked up his toolbox and handed it to him because his hands were full and she needed him to understand, without saying it plainly that she knew what she was looking at. They walked back up through the stairwell together. Aldous Harwick was waiting at the top. He was no longer alone. He had 2 members of the hospital's security compliance team with him and his phone in his hand, and when Tobias came through the door, Aldous told him his access badge was suspended immediately and that his contract with Pinnacle Medical was terminated for unauthorized access to restricted equipment in violation of facility safety protocol. Tobias did not argue. He had been told this before in different buildings by different men in good suits. He handed Aldous his badge without being asked. Vera told Aldous that she had authorized the access, that she had witnessed the panel restoration, and that she would be filing her own incident report within the hour. Aldous said her authorization did not extend to contractor personnel conducting technical interventions outside their assigned scope. He said the matter would go to HR, and that Vera should make sure she understood her own position before she put anything in writing. Vera said she was comfortable with her position. Aldous walked away. By the time Tobias reached the parking structure and called to check on Milo, who was asleep at a neighbor's apartment and answered the phone confused and annoyed, which meant he was fine. The news had already moved through the hospital's night staff. The surgical team knew what had happened. The recovery room nurses knew. The compliance auditors, whose entire framework for the evening had become considerably more complicated, were asking quiet questions in the operations office about the maintenance alert log. What happened next came fast. The following morning, Aldous presented the board's compliance coordinator with 3 items: edited footage from a sub-basement camera showing Tobias at the disconnect panel before the alert system registered any voltage anomaly, making it appear he had opened the panel without cause, a printout of a bank transfer made 3 days earlier to a savings account in the name of Tobias Merrill, originating from a vendor company connected to the hospital's generator maintenance contractor, and a summary of Tobias's 3 maintenance alerts, reframed as a pattern of escalatory behavior designed to manufacture a crisis. The implication was clear. Aldous did not say it plainly. He didn't have to. By noon, 2 investigators from the hospital's legal team arrived at Tobias's apartment building. Milo was home from school, doing math at the kitchen table with his continuous glucose monitor clipped to his arm. When Tobias opened the door, the investigators explained they needed him to come in for questioning regarding potential contract fraud and deliberate interference with hospital infrastructure. Milo looked up from his homework. Tobias asked whether he was being detained. They said no, it was voluntary. He asked whether he should bring an attorney. They said that was his choice. He turned to Milo and told him to call Mrs. Ferrante next door. He told him he would be back before dinner. Milo was 11 and he was smart, and he looked at his father's face and understood something was wrong that neither of them had words for yet. He asked whether the people at the hospital were safe. Tobias said yes. Milo asked why they were taking him then. Tobias didn't answer that. He put his hand briefly on the back of Milo's head, the way he had done since Milo was 3 years old, and still small enough to fit under Tobias's chin, and then he picked up his jacket and went. He did not look back because if he had, he would not have left. In the 2 days that followed, Aldous moved efficiently. He contacted the staffing agency and ensured Tobias's suspension became termination. He requested that the maintenance alert log be flagged for legal review and access restricted. He called the board's risk management director and described the situation as an isolated incident of contractor misconduct complicated by security overreach. Vera spent those same 2 days looking for Carmen Boyle. Carmen was Pinnacle Medical's director of internal compliance, a position technically independent of hospital operations, and reporting directly to the board rather than to the administrative structure Aldous controlled. She had been off-site during the financial review's first day and had learned about the previous night's events from a recovery room nurse who had been on shift when the lights went out. Carmen was methodical and thorough and entirely unimpressed by people who tried to limit her access to records she was authorized to review. When Vera sat across from her and described what she had witnessed in the sub-basement, Carmen did not say anything for a long moment. She asked to see Vera's incident report. She asked for the timestamps on the 3 maintenance alerts. Then she opened the maintenance system on her own terminal, using board-level access that Aldous could not restrict, and began working backward through the audit trail. The alerts were there, all 3 timestamped correctly. The first had been received by the operations office at 10:15 and assigned to a duty queue. At 10:47, someone with supervisor credentials had changed the priority classification from urgent to routine without leaving a note. At 11:38, the same credentials had marked all 3 alerts as reviewed and resolved, 9 minutes before the voltage drop that sent the OR team into controlled panic. The credentials belonged to Aldous Harwick. Carmen went further. She found the generator maintenance routing schedule filed at the start of the maintenance window. The routing error that had placed the OR circuit on generator B's overloaded feed was not in the original schedule. It had been added as an amendment at 8:51 p.m., 40 minutes after the maintenance window opened, using an authorization code assigned to a vendor account that should have been deactivated after a contract change 6 months earlier. The amended routing order bore Aldous's digital signature. Carmen called the board chair and requested an emergency session. She copied Vera. She did not call Aldous. Aldous found out anyway. He moved to lock the compliance records server that same afternoon. The server was already backed up. Carmen had pulled a copy 2 hours earlier, because in 15 years of internal compliance work, she had learned that the moment you find something important is always the moment someone starts trying to make it disappear. What happened in the server room that evening was later described by the building's fire investigation team as an electrical fault in a junction box that had been improperly serviced during the afternoon's generator maintenance work. The fault caused a surge through the records corridor, triggered automatic fire suppression in the server alcove, and locked the fire doors on that level. Carmen was inside the room with one of her staff when the suppression system activated. She got out. Her staff member did not at first. Vera called Tobias at 9:17 that evening. He was at the kitchen table helping Milo with homework, trying to make the evening feel ordinary while his bank account and his phone and his entire sense of the immediate future sat in quiet crisis around him. Vera told him what had happened. She told him Carmen's staff member was trapped behind a locked fire door on the records level, and the evening maintenance crew couldn't reach the manual release because the surge had taken out lighting on that corridor. Tobias was silent for a moment. He looked at the math worksheet on the table, then at Milo, who had looked up from his pencil with the particular attentiveness of a child who has learned to read the room. He told Vera he understood the position it put him in. If he went back into that building, Aldous would say he had returned to destroy evidence. Every accusation would compound. Vera said she knew. She said it was his decision. He asked if the person inside was hurt. Vera said she didn't know yet. Tobias put the pencil down and looked at his son for a long moment. He told Milo to stay with Mrs. Ferrante. He told him he had to go help someone. Milo was quiet in the way that meant he was calculating, not accepting, and then he asked his father to come back. Tobias said he would. He picked up his red toolbox and went to the door, and then he stopped for a moment with his back to the room, because there are things a person carries that are not in any toolbox, and sometimes the weight of them needs a second to settle before you can walk straight. Then he walked. The records corridor was dark in the way of a space that has been specifically told to be dark. Emergency strips along the floor, nothing overhead, fire suppression foam drying white against the wall panels. Vera had gotten him in through a maintenance entrance on the building's east side that Aldous's people didn't know about, because Vera had spent 8 months learning this building the same way Tobias had. The locked fire door at the end of the corridor had a manual release behind a panel cover on the right side, third screw from the top, the same as every Pinnacle fire door, because the building had been designed by one firm and they had used one template. Tobias opened his toolbox, removed what he needed, and had the panel off in 4 minutes. The release engaged. Carmen's staff member, a young compliance analyst named Bryce Osee, was on the floor inside with smoke inhalation and a cut on his forearm from a fallen rack bracket. He was conscious and trying to stand. Tobias lifted him, settled the young man's arm across his shoulders, and walked him out. Outside, in the parking structure, Vera's body camera was still running. It captured footage of a man who had been paid to trigger the surge, a building maintenance contractor who had no scheduled work that evening and was carrying tools specific to the junction box that failed. When police arrived in response to the fire call, the contractor was still in the parking structure. He had worked for 3 companies since leaving Pinnacle's direct employ, all of them subsidiaries of a property services group managed by Aldous Harwick's brother-in-law. The man was frightened and not loyal, and he told investigators what he had been asked to do and by whom in under an hour. Combined with Carmen's backup drive, the maintenance alert timestamps, and the amended routing order bearing Aldous' signature, the evidence took very little time to become conclusive. 3 days later, the board convened an emergency session in the hospital's administrative conference room. Aldous was present with 2 attorneys. Carmen presented the logs. Vera played the relevant segment from her body camera footage. The board's external counsel noted the documentary trail connecting the routing error, the alert suppression, the edited security footage, and the payment to Milo's account, which investigators had traced to a transfer initiated through a vendor invoice Aldous had personally approved. Aldous said the evidence had been assembled out of context. He said Tobias had been given unusual access by a security director acting outside her authority. He said the routing error had been a clerical mistake by a vendor, and that he had taken appropriate steps to investigate before the incident escalated. The board chair asked him why the maintenance alerts had been marked resolved before the voltage drop. Aldous did not have an answer that fit the timestamps. Police officers were waiting outside the conference room when the session ended. Aldous was arrested on charges of falsifying safety records, willful endangerment, obstruction of an investigation, and fraud. He walked past the board members with his attorneys on either side, and none of the people who had deferred to him for 11 years moved to help. Tobias came to the hospital 2 days after the arrest, at the board's request. He wore the same gray work shirt he had worn the night of the surgery. He brought nothing except his notebook, which he opened on the conference table, and from which he read, in a calm and level voice, the exact text of his 3 maintenance alerts, the times they were filed and the time each was reclassified or suppressed. Then he closed the notebook and said he had a question for the board. He said, "How many contract workers in this building were currently paying out of pocket for medications their children needed to survive, because the staffing structure this facility used allowed it to avoid providing benefits to the people doing its most essential work?" The room was quiet. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform anger. He simply waited, the way a man waits who has spent a long time in rooms where he was expected to stay silent, and has learned that silence can be louder than almost anything else. The board chair said that the facility's staffing structure was a matter the board would need to review carefully. Tobias said, "Yes, it is." The board offered him a settlement, a public statement of exoneration, and a permanent position in a senior electrical engineering capacity. He declined the settlement. He accepted the exoneration. He said he would take the position on 2 conditions: that it include authority to conduct independent safety audits without requiring director-level approval, and that as a condition of his acceptance, the board commit within 60 days to extending health coverage to all contracted technical staff working more than 20 hours per week at the facility. The board chair asked whether he had other conditions. Tobias said only one: that no maintenance alert submitted by any employee at any level could be suppressed or reclassified without a documented reason accessible to the compliance office. They agreed to all 3. He shook the board chair's hand and walked out into a corridor where Vera Montoya was waiting, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed and an expression that was not quite a smile, but was its immediate neighbor. She asked him how it went. He said it went fine. She said she noticed he didn't take the money. Tobias thought about Milo's glucose monitor, and the insulin in the refrigerator at home, and the monthly cost of the medication that kept his son's body doing what it was supposed to do without being asked. He thought about the 7 other contract workers he knew of at Pinnacle who were managing the same calculation every month, staying in jobs that underpaid them because the alternative was worse. He said the money wasn't the point. Vera nodded. She had known that. She had known it since the sub-basement, when he had closed the cabinet door and relatched the lock before he did anything else. The habit of a person who finishes what he starts and leaves things right behind him. 6 weeks later, Tobias Merrill stood in the main electrical bay of Pinnacle Medical Center, walking 3 newly hired contract technicians through the facility's generator routing protocol. He had rewritten it himself, with Comte Carmen's help, in language that left no room for the kind of amendment Aldous had inserted on the night of the surgery. Posted beside every alert terminal in the building was the new policy. Any safety alert received and not acted upon within 30 minutes required escalation to the compliance office. No exceptions. No reclassification without documentation. Milo came by after school on Fridays now. He would sit in the break room with his glucose meter and his homework, and the specific expression of a kid who is proud of his father, and does not yet know how to say it without it coming out sideways. The staff had begun leaving snacks on the table on Fridays without being asked, because that is what people do in a building where they have learned, slowly, that the ones who keep the lights on deserve to be seen. Tobias didn't talk much about the night in the sub-basement. He didn't need to. The work spoke clearly enough. It always had. He had simply been in a building for a long time where no one had been listening. They were listening now.